Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome again to our session this week, to a new week. This week, we start our third module. We're excited about that. And it's going to be on principles, techniques, and lessons learned for the advocacy for Indigenous women. And our guest is already here, but before we can invite her, I'm going to invite Anima to please open for us with an invocation before we can continue to our session. So Anima, please go ahead.
Good evening to all. Okay, I'll start the prayers, and after that I'll explain what is the meaning of the prayer. Ama mailuma dolo sorima dolo potima nono plumzao nono surizao ang opung tui num opung nani num opung tui ang bo opung nai ani mupung ni ICD ani nupung nai tong phai nono ang surizao ama sengni nebasa nang tuno naidi chini hukumu chini mukumu nang narakdi chini nogo phaidi ama chuno hamrati ama mailuma ang nono plumzao. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Sorry
It's
to all.
okay.
Yeah, actually,
Okay, Anima.
I haven't been in touch with my cultural prayer for a long time. So, sorry about that. It's kind of touching my heart right now. Actually, we have got, different prayers in different occasions. So, the prayers I said is not perfect because we have forgotten our prayers basically. Our youth, I'm one of them. We don't know how to pray. But this prayer is basically we pray for we thank God for giving us in abundance, especially because we are people who cultivate paddies, okay, rice cultivation. So this prayer is done at home. We have a pot where we store rice, and this is basically we are praying to Mailuma. Mailuma is the god who fills us with rice, who fills our stomach. So that's why we pray to her, giving thanks to her and asking her to stay with us in our house, be with us in our house, feed our family members. So we pray her for that. So this prayer is particularly for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anima, and thank you for sharing that prayer with us. And thank you also for just letting us know what it's about and your journey in reconnecting with your culture and your cultural practices. So thank you so much for that very moving prayer. And yes, for everyone else, this is also a very safe space for everyone. So, and we're all going through different journeys, and so everyone is welcome to share anything they feel comfortable to share with us in this space. So thank you again, Anima. We're grateful for that invocation, for that opening for today. So I'm going to invite our speaker for today. And before I invite her to begin her session with us, I will read out her bio so that we know a little bit more about her before she begins. So Georgie Carino is an Ibaloi Igorot from the Cordillera region in the Philippines, is an active advocate for Indigenous peoples' human rights at the community, national, and international levels. She's currently a senior policy advisor for the Forest Peoples Program in the UK. Her work has covered Indigenous knowledge and traditional occupations, cultural and biological diversity, and international standards on forests and biodiversity, water and energy, extractive industries, and food and agriculture. She's co-lead author of the Local Biodiversity Outlooks, Contributions of Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities to the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020, and to Renewing Nature and Cultures. Current focus is on community-based mapping and monitoring as tools for local governance and the coordination of a global network of centers of distinction on Indigenous and local knowledge. She has served as a member of the UN Secretary General Scientific Advisory Board, UNSAB, and as commissioner of the World Commission on Dams. She's currently a member of the International Panel on Experts of Sustainable Food Systems, as food. So thank you so much, Georgie, for being with us today, and thank you for accepting our invitation to come and speak to us, not just during this time, but also in previous sessions of the Global Leadership School. And so welcome, and it's also nice to see you, albeit online, but it's also always great to see you. So please feel welcome. Let us know how we can support you for the session if you need any support, and we're here for, we're ready to learn from you and to hear from your experiences. So welcome, Georgie. Your mic is muted. You're on mute.
Okay. Thanks very much for that introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to this leadership school. I'm always glad to be able to work with Indigenous women and sisters. In fact, my educational training is as an educator, so I always give high priority to activities amongst us. I've been asked to talk about key principles for international advocacy. And perhaps most of you would know this already, but it is always good to review this and also take from our examples of doing international advocacy. I'll be showing some slides. I don't know if this has been shared to everyone, but they're available for sharing. So I'll begin my sharing of the slides. Okay. Do you see my slide, the show? Okay. So we're going to cover important principles today. Self-determined development or self-determination, land, territories and resources, free prior informed consent, Indigenous participation, and respect for traditional knowledge. I'm sure you would already have come across these key principles. So let's review them anyway so that they become firmly understood in our advocacy work, right? So we probably know that a key fundamental text containing these principles is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'll just make a key point around advocacy. Today, we're also having another course on advocacy with Partners for Indigenous Peoples Philippines. And we were underlining that advocacy work is not apolitical. And the reason for that is because Indigenous peoples are actually central actors in developing our own lives, and particularly in light of the very serious crisis in the world today, Indigenous peoples have so much to contribute, even if in our history we have been oppressed and not given the respect and protection of our rights. At this very crucial time in history, there is increasing recognition of our very important contributions, particularly if they are founded on our own cultures, values, and ways of living with nature and the earth. So this whole issue of so all of these key principles that we will cover are really underpinning our contributions and our rights. So these provide solid foundations for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women for asserting our collective and individual rights, and also holding governments to account for their human rights obligations. Indeed, we need to understand that as peoples, we are distinct from states, and that we hold these rights by virtue of us being human and us being the original collectivities, even prior to the establishment of states, right? The principles we discuss are not abstract and just contained in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They actually apply at community, local, national, and international levels, and also to various policy arenas. So we need to become adept at applying these principles in different policy arenas which we engage. Also, these key principles actually unite Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women across the world, because through the 20-year process to negotiate this with states, we also built strong unities amongst ourselves to understand these principles. We were also learning as well as asserting and articulating these key principles. So they are the basis for solidarity and alliance building with other peoples and movements who are also asserting their rights and are also working for a transformation of current structures. So in this module, we will try to contribute to deepening understanding about fundamental principles and rights that underpin the policy work of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women, and in promoting the full exercise of our individual and collective rights and those of our peoples. We have very simple aims for this module. So I expect that upon completion, we will be familiar with key principles and rights underpinning policy advocacy, right, including articles of the UN Declaration. We will understand diverse examples about the use of these key principles in the advocacy work, which will deepen our comprehension, not just of facts, but also how these are applied. We should be able to analyze texts arising from different policy processes for their compliance or violation of Indigenous principles and rights. So we should be able to analyze. We should be capable of applying these principles in our advocacy strategies and campaigns, whether these happen at local, national, regional, or international policy process. So the issue of application. And also link up our own community priorities with these strategic messages and principles. again, these are simple because we have the lived experience of these key principles. So I've just presented the aims and objectives of the module. And each of the 5 principles will be presented and illustrated by an example. I'll focus now on the Convention on Biological Diversity because I've just come from the negotiations of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And we can use those examples and have short discussions about them, right? So self-determination and self-determined development, I refer to the key documents and principles that are contained in the UN Declaration, right? So we'll take that up for 60 minutes of the time. And in the final 20 minutes, you yourselves as participants will also write your own takeaways from what we are learning today. And also identify some issues that we wish to study further, right? Okay, so these are the source materials and references: the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the FIMI Global Study on the Situation of Indigenous Women and Girls, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was just adopted December 2022, Transforming Our World, which is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. So if you want to look into those references, you can do so. Okay, so now let's go to the principles themselves. Obviously, the key one is the right to self-determination. And the 2 international covenants on civil and political rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights contain these articles on self-determination. Let's try to understand them, right? All peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. All peoples may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation, based upon the principle of mutual benefit and international law. Now, this final phrase is very important. In no case may a people be deprived of their own means of subsistence. Usually, people always talk about self-determination, on the freedom to determine our political status. But this other one, not to be deprived of our own means of subsistence, actually means permanent sovereignty over our resources, right? And this is a right of peoples, not of states, because we're talking about human rights, right? These are our rights, and governments have obligations to respect them. The state parties to the present covenant, including those having responsibility for the administration of non-self-governing and trust territories, shall promote the realization of the right of self-determination and shall respect that right in conformity with the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations. And this very same principle is echoed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we call UNDRIP, Article 3. Indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So this was the biggest hurdle to negotiate with governments and states before finally the UN Declaration was adopted. in 2007 by the UN General Assembly. So this is very significant because there, the UN and states affirmed that indeed this right of self-determination of peoples is a right of indigenous peoples. Let's go to the articles on lands, territories, and resources. Article 26. Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. And states shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the indigenous peoples concerned. So our right to our lands, territories arise from customary tenure, not because governments are giving us our rights to our lands, but because of our own management of those lands, our use, our occupation, and our own tenure systems. Because around the world, indigenous peoples have different customary tenure systems among pastoralists, among fishers, among farmers. So all of those, our rights to these arise from customary use and customary rules and law, right? By the way, you can raise your hand anytime to say something. I cannot see the raised hands or in the chat, but if I ask our facilitators to tell me if there's a raised hand or something in the chat.
We don't have anything yet, but I'll let you know if there's a question or a raised hand.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah. So what is the significance of self-determination and relationship with the land? And this comes from FIMI's own study. Indigenous peoples' ways of life, cultures, and traditions have evolved over hundreds of years through very close connection with nature and land. Access to land and natural resources is essential to the ability of indigenous peoples to maintain and develop our distinct identities and cultures, as well as to develop economically, right? As a consequence, self-determination and the relationship with land will be emphasized as they encompass most of the critical areas of concern, shaping the particular condition of indigenous women and as indigenous, dealing with individual and collective rights simultaneously. Thus, access to land, land rights, and land dispossession are deeply interconnected. They connect with poverty, health, violence, armed conflicts, economies, human rights, and the environment. So this is really, as is often said, for indigenous peoples, land is life. And depending on our good or declining relationship with our land, these other things also come into play, right? And of course, the defense of territory, because women and men belonging to indigenous peoples and local communities are at the forefront of struggles to protect the lands we depend on for physical, cultural, and spiritual well-being. In addition to protecting our lands from externally driven destruction, indigenous peoples have been actively caring for their territories and all life within a sacred kin, our relations, right? Through their traditional knowledge systems, customary practices, and through innovative new approaches. So indigenous societies around the world, men, women, and others, hold particular and often complementary roles and responsibilities in governing their traditional territories and sustaining biodiversity within the homelands. So these roles are continually being renewed in response to current realities. So being attentive to the gender dynamics of land care and ecological knowledge, which are rooted in the specific cultural values of indigenous societies and local communities, can further enable indigenous-led approaches, for example, to sustaining biological diversity. So political advocacy is very much a political act including defense of these lands and territories and the accompanying values and cultures and social relations that accompany that, right? So when our land rights are violated, this has very strong impacts on even our social structures. For example, they take away the forest, how we relate to the forest and harvest and use those, even in terms of spirituality, all these get affected, right? So this is also underlined by the CEDAW General Recommendation 39. I'm sure you've been also studying this. This is the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And in the past, they have mostly considered individual rights of women and were quite silent or weak on the collective rights of indigenous peoples, women and girls, right? And this is just a quotation from them, from the general recommendation. Intersectional discrimination against women and girls must be understood, taking into account the multifaceted nature of their identity. As women and girls, they face discrimination and gender-based violence frequently committed by state and non-state actors. These forms of violence and discrimination are widespread and often remain in impunity. Indigenous women and girls also often have an inextricable link and relation to their peoples, to the lands and territories, to natural resources and culture. So to comply with Articles 1 and 2 and other relevant provisions of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, state actions, legislation, and policies must reflect and respect the multifaceted identity of indigenous women. So, apart from the stress on understanding intersectionality, the many facets of our identities, it also underlines the fact that in the same way, because we are also indigenous peoples, we have this inextricable link to our people, to the lands, territories, and resources and culture. So again, this comes from the FEMI global study. I don't know if many of you have studied this. So states and non-state actors should respect indigenous peoples' rights to free prior informed consent, to protect indigenous territories as crucial areas for the resilience of the social, cultural, and ecological lives of humanity and of the natural world, and focus investment on addressing the consequences of climate change on these lands, ensuring the participation of indigenous women, and that their ancestral knowledge of ecological protection is respected. Here, we are entering into another dimension of self-determination. This is the requirement for free prior informed consent. Because of self-determination and our relationship to our lands, any interventions that will affect our land, our knowledge, and our resources requires free prior informed consent, right? And in a way, this has been understood as also as a principle, because it links to self-determination, but also it is a key requirement so as to avoid human rights abuses, but also to ensure that indeed we have the freedom to pursue our own economic, social, and cultural development. Because once our lands, territories, and resources are lost, indeed it deprives us of our own means of subsistence. And this is a core principle, in a way also as a safeguard, or to ensure that rights to self-determination and lands are respected, right? So it is both a substantive and a procedural right or principle. Okay, let us look at how this is being applied, for example, in this time environmental law, in, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the most recent approved strategy. They have a whole section on reducing threats to biodiversity. And the first target is that all areas are under participatory, integrated, and biodiversity inclusive spatial planning and or effective management processes addressing land and sea use change to bring the loss of areas of high biodiversity importance, including ecosystems of high ecological integrity, close to zero by 2030, while respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. As we know, there is a biodiversity crisis. The rates of biodiversity loss are so high that there is a strong push by governments, because this is a intergovernmental agreement, but also includes whole society, to really, land use change is the greatest driver of biodiversity loss. And this is the conversion of natural areas and territories into other uses like mining, dams, plantations, etc., right? In the past, indigenous territories were excluded from spatial planning. So the government feels that they have the freedom to completely put their economic projects wherever they want, right? And that is a national economic priority. But now, under the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, to address land use and sea use change, they will increase spatial planning, but they will respect the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. So this is one way in which those principles are now being incorporated into environmental law. And that is a major victory. The indigenous peoples fought very hard for this, and were able to include this in the biodiversity plan, right? This one you may have heard of. It's called the 30 by 30 target for conservation. Ensure and enable that by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial and inland water and coastal and marine areas come under protection, right? Here, what indigenous peoples fought for was that before it was just conserved areas, right? And then ecologically representative and well-connected. What we were able to include is equitably governed systems. And then we still have protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. But here, recognizing indigenous and traditional territories. Because in the past, one of the main causes or drivers of resettlement and displacement of indigenous peoples have been conservation, the imposition of parks and state-controlled conservation, what's sometimes called fortress conservation, right? Integrated into wider landscapes, seascapes, and the ocean, while ensuring any sustainable use where appropriate in such areas is fully consistent with conservation outcomes. And here they again stressed recognizing and respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, including over their traditional territories. So in fact, this was a bottom line of those who were going to the CBD negotiations, that unless we had respect for our territories, because our territories now contain the best biodiversity, the overlap between biodiversity and our territories is extremely high, right? So instead of just these state-controlled protected areas or other conservation measures, indigenous territories are actually another pathway for conservation, which has already been proven, because our territories are actually better, have more biodiversity than even the state protected areas. And this has been proven by the evidence of those who are studying these measures. Okay, free prior informed consent. Article 19, states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. So that's the UN declaration. And in the World Conference, the outcome of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, this was held 10 years after the adoption of the UN declaration. This is what states committed. We recognize commitments made by states with regard to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources. So that was a affirmation again after 10 years of UNDRIP that the government said they would do this, right? Okay, now let's go back again to the CBD, the biodiversity strategy that was approved, right? In Target 22, again, this was hard fought. Ensure the full, equitable, inclusive, effective, and gender responsive representation and participation in decision making and access to justice and information related to biodiversity by indigenous peoples and local communities, respecting their cultures and their rights over lands, territories, resources, and traditional knowledge, as well as by women and girls, children and youth, and persons with disabilities, and ensure the full protection of environmental human rights defenders. So this is the target under the biodiversity strategy that respects and upholds the rights that are mentioned in this target. Okay, yeah, before target 22, there's also target 21, which is to ensure that the best available data, information, and knowledge are accessible to decision makers, practitioners, and the public to guide effective and equitable governance, integrated and participatory management of biodiversity, and to strengthen communication, awareness raising, education, monitoring, research, and knowledge management. And also in this context, traditional knowledge, innovations, practices, and technologies of indigenous peoples and local communities should only be accessed with their free, prior, informed consent, right? So previous to the negotiation, traditional knowledge was being given a high status similar to science with the best available data information knowledge for decision making, right? But then actually our knowledge is not for free public access, right? It always has to be with our free prior informed consent. So that is another example of how that principle is being applied in advocacy. Okay. Full and effective participation. In Article 5, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions, while retaining their right to participate fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, social, and cultural life of the state. So here, Indigenous governance and institutions are recognized, and we also have the right to fully participate if we so choose in the institutions of the state or broader society. Again, this is recognizing self-determination, but also our freedom to determine our political status, right? And that is also connected to free prior informed consent, right? So yeah, this is, for example, reinforced with Article 18. Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own indigenous decision-making institutions. So really, this is respecting customary law and customary institutions and governance, right? And again, from the outcome of the World Conference, the governments say, we commit ourselves to supporting the empowerment of Indigenous women and to formulating and implementing, in collaboration with Indigenous peoples, in particular Indigenous women and their organizations, policies and programs designed to promote capacity building and strengthen their leadership. We support measures that will ensure the full and effective participation of Indigenous women in decision-making processes at all levels and in all areas, and eliminate barriers to their participation in political, economic, social, and cultural life. So in policy advocacy, because of our multifaceted identities, of course, we are promoting our collective rights as Indigenous peoples, but always attentive to the position of Indigenous women. And that is also successfully carried out in the advocacy work that is done at the international level. Now, why is this very important, that issue of full and effective participation? Again, from the FIMI Global Study, right? It says, although there has been progress regarding the political participation of Indigenous women at the national and international levels, thanks to the strengthening of Indigenous women's organizations and their advocacy capacity, Indigenous women continue to face critical barriers to their effective and equal participation in Indigenous and non-Indigenous local, national, and international institutions. We are less represented and included in meaningful political decision-making at the national and local levels due to a lack of recognition of Indigenous peoples in national constitutions and law, discrimination and marginalization, lower levels of education, domestic and care-related responsibilities, and political violence. So here, this is recognizing the continuing discrimination and not full value being given to Indigenous women's role in decision-making, right? again, more on decision making. The improvement of the political, social, economic, and health circumstances of Indigenous women and their families requires parity for Indigenous women in all policy discussions on issues concerning them directly. So this is going directly to this principle of equal participation in decision making. This is especially true for issues related to food sovereignty, climate change, economic sustainability, the health and well-being of Indigenous women, children, and communities, and large-scale development projects that have a direct impact on lands and territories. States should ensure the full and effective participation of Indigenous women, girls, and youth during the national process for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And this includes decision-making on mechanisms, action plans, and budgetary allocations. States, Indigenous peoples, self-government institutions, regional intergovernmental bodies, and the international community should provide technical assistance and funding to Indigenous women's organizations at the local, national, and international levels, and involve them in meaningful political decision-making processes. Okay. So despite progress in the domain of policies and programs, sometimes governments adopt policies and programs for gender equality. Almost all governments say this. Indigenous women do not usually participate in the development and formulation of national policy, and gender issues are not prioritized in Indigenous self-government institutions. Institutional mechanisms, when present, have limited capacity and scarce economic resources to ensure the effective implementation of meaningful public policies addressing Indigenous women. Moreover, national and global statistics frequently lack disaggregated data to capture socioeconomic and cultural inequalities, jeopardizing the visibility of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women and girls in official data. This critical deficiency encompasses all areas: education, health, economic empowerment, political participation, and violence. In countries where Indigenous peoples lack formal recognition, data collection and the development of evidence-based public policies represent an even greater challenge. This issue of generating data, of course, as Indigenous women, we know directly our experiences, right? So the need for our visibility is if we are able to actually develop our own monitoring systems and present the results of our own participatory research or our own stories, right? Because especially in official statistics, this is still an issue, right? So for example, there may be statistics on gender in a country. If they don't have an Indigenous identifier in the statistics, they won't be able to see the status of Indigenous women vis-a-vis, say, women in general, right? Or the situation of Indigenous peoples vis-a-vis the national situation, right? And this is very critical to actually addressing discrimination. So the more we are able to tell our stories and also produce the data needed to tell our stories, then this is a core area of Indigenous women's advocacy. For example, in Cameroon, using the Indigenous Navigator, that's the tool that monitors implementation of the UN Declaration, they were able to find that Indigenous persons and especially the women, do not have any identity papers because they are born in rural areas and their births are not registered. And because they require that birth certificate to get an identity paper or identification card, they're effectively not citizens and they cannot access health, education, and other social services that the state provides. And that is because there are no rural health clinics in the territories of indigenous peoples. And so these births are not registered, right? So even that simple fact of absence of birth registration means that they lose their citizenship rights. Okay. Okay, again, in the biodiversity strategy that was adopted, and again, this was fought for by women, including indigenous women, there is a target that says, ensure gender equality in the implementation of the framework through a gender-responsive approach where all women and girls have equal opportunity and capacity to contribute to the three objectives of the convention. That's conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of biodiversity, and benefit sharing arising from the use of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge, right? Including by recognizing their equal rights and access to land and natural resources, and their full, equitable, meaningful, and informed participation and leadership at all levels of action, engagement, policy, and decision-making related to biodiversity. So again, in that strategy, there is one target addressing gender and the rights of indigenous women and girls, right? And women in general. And then it has a gender plan of action where all people, which has three outcomes and many actions. All people, in particular, all women and girls, have equal opportunity and capacity to contribute to the objectives of the convention. Biodiversity policy planning and programming decisions address equally the perspective, interests, needs, and human rights of all people, in particular, all women and girls. And enabling conditions are created to ensure gender-responsive implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Let's go to I think this is the final key principle on traditional knowledge and institutions. So Article 31 of UNDRIP, Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of the properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, literatures, designs, sports, and traditional games, and visual and performing arts. They have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. And this is the duty of states. In conjunction with indigenous peoples, states shall take effective measures to recognize and protect the exercise of these rights. And here, again, in the CEDAW general recommendation, it identifies and addresses different forms of intersectional discrimination faced by indigenous women and girls, and their role as leaders, knowledge bearers, and cultural transmitters within their peoples, communities, families, and society as a whole. The committee has consistently identified patterns of discrimination faced by indigenous women and girls in the exercise of their human rights and the factors that continue exacerbating discrimination against indigenous women and girls. Such discrimination is often intersectional and based on factors such as sex, gender, indigenous origin, status or identity, race, ethnicity, disability, age, language, economic status, living with HIV/AIDS, amongst others. So all of those other conditions or parts of the identity which reinforce discrimination faced by indigenous women and girls, right, are recognized in the CEDAW general recommendation. So in the United Nations, traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge is addressed by many institutions. The CBD, which is has a strong focus on traditional knowledge, WIPO, or the World Intellectual Property Organization, obviously based on intellectual property, right? It has also a special committee called the Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge and Folklore. There is this new body called the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES. It has a task force on indigenous and local knowledge and an approach paper and participatory process for our participation, right? And then that's also true in the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, on farmers' rights, and also in climate change that has established a local communities and indigenous peoples platform. So I think we covered this, Target 2021, right? The prior informed consent for traditional knowledge in biodiversity decision making. Okay. I'll stop here for now. Let's open the session for some discussion and questions. And also from your own experience, how have you used these principles to understand your own everyday situation? And how have you used this in your advocacy work? Remember that these principles apply at all levels, whether it's the local level, subnational, national, regional, or global level. These are the universal standards that apply in our advocacy. So let's open it up for your own experiences, but also to add your own perspectives and even questions on this matter.
Yeah, you can put your hand up or write on the chat in case your internet is not very good, but you can put your hand up or just unmute and ask or share your experience.
For example, if I ask you, I don't know if you have a pen and paper with you. Why don't you write down one takeaway, one or two takeaways that you have learned as a result of this session on key principles of underlying policy advocacy of indigenous women? So maybe take 1 minute or two to write down something on what is your takeaway, and then you can share this. You can also, if there's also anything you want to learn more about these principles, you can also voice that so we can have a discussion.
I'm sorry, I cannot open my cam because the connection is bad. But I'm Regina from Indonesia.
Yes.
You might have heard that my country planned to relocate our capital city, which is
Yes.
now in Java Island in Jakarta, but they're going to move it to the east of um east of Borneo. So
Yes.
there are like hundred of thousand hectares of land that will cleared to build a new castle. It was the indigenous land. So I would like to ask what kind of mechanism that we could use, so the governments, that we hope that there be a room for discussion between the indigenous peoples and a policymaker in order to find the solutions and minimize all the risks in the futures. And then we would like suggest also, like we would like to know the positions of indigenous people there, how is their attachment to the forest, land, and waters, and what are the fact that there is not the kind of like for definition and this to guide the actions side of this process.
Yes, that is one of the more serious what do you call, decisions or development that will result in both land grabbing and also displacement of indigenous peoples. I'm not familiar with the actions that were already taken by the indigenous peoples in Indonesia. You know, in international policy, what do you call, meetings, the Indonesian government is one of those that insists that the masyarakat adat, or those who are governed by custom, they do not equate that with indigenous peoples. But of course, in international law, you are the peoples, you are indigenous peoples there in Indonesia, right? So the available, now this will be the formal, what do you call, formal, not exactly remedies, but has this already been brought to court? Uh, the legality, but also the consequences or impacts of that decision, right? Because with respect to relocation and displacement, there are actually international standards that will apply, right? First is of course to avoid relocation or displacement, right? Because exactly of those rights that we have just, or principles we have studied. The other one is through impact assessment to try and minimize the impacts, to avoid or to minimize the impacts. And then there will be additional what do you call, requirements. You know, in international law, relocation or displacement cannot actually happen without free prior informed consent, which was why I was asking whether this has been taken, say, to a court for adjudication, because those are properties of indigenous peoples, right? Or if there is no national remedy to bring it to the international courts, for example, the treaty bodies, those bodies that were mentioned, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So there are many levels of advocacy. One is at the executive level, right? Try to address it through the executive branch. Another is the judicial level, try to address it via courts and access to justice. Another one is the legislative level, while the process is still being discussed whether or not that new capital should be built, right? So those are avenues for possible policy advocacy. But without fully understanding the context, it's hard to advise, for example, you or the people there on how they will apply these principles. You're in the best position to understand that, right? I don't know if that helps to answer your questions, because if there is no recourse to in national law, the next is recourse to in regional or international mechanisms. Like in Latin America, oftentimes indigenous peoples and indigenous women go to the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, and they have gotten many favorable judgments from there. But in Asia, we do not have a regional court. So the next after the national court is the international law or international court.
I think the question
Go
or
ahead.
comment, there's a question or comment on the chat, and I'm going to ask our interpreters to please assist us. It's in Spanish.
Yes, Winnie, give me a moment to read it. Elizabeth says, in particular, I would like to know more about these principles, the autonomy, free, basic self-governance, free determination or self-determination, because often our indigenous brothers themselves create obstacles for political participation of women inside our communities, using as justification the autonomy or self-determination of the collective group. How can we clarify that the violations of our self-governance or autonomy and self-determination is for the exterior, that is outwardly and not inwardly? So and how indigenous women can also be part of the collective. And I believe that everyone should just one moment. Okay. Excuse me one moment. I'm sorry for interrupting, Joy. This is Carmen. I was interpreting the question from Elizabeth into English when you asked Siham to ask her question. So I believe that perhaps you were not hearing me interpret into English.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. It's a perfect moment then to advise everyone to please select a channel so that you can also hear the interpreter when interpreting into English, because other participants might not have heard the question. If you allow me, before Siham proceeds, I'd like to repeat that question for the benefit of everyone.
Yes, please do.
I'll do that now. And now I'm in the English channel. The question from Elizabeth is, in particular, I'd like to know more about these principles, the self-determination and governance question or issues, because often it is our own indigenous brothers who create obstacles for political participation of women in our communities, using as justification that self-governance or self-determination of the collective group. How can we clarify that this is a violation of self-determination so that indigenous women can also be part of this collective, of this group, and participate in the process? That's Elizabeth's question.
Yes, that's an important question that you have put, because we often meet this in our own experiences and our organizations. So first, self-determination is of the people as a whole. So to try and exclude people like women and girls from that whole is actually weakening self-determination, because self-determination is stronger when the whole collective is considered and involved, right? So all of those principles that we discussed, our own relationship to our lands, self-determination, free prior informed consent, participation. Self-determination is about the people, right? And if within this discrimination or obstacles put by, say, indigenous men or the indigenous organization, the structure, that means they don't actually understand the full meaning of self-determination, because the self-determination is of the whole people, right? It's not the self-determination of men or just the self-determination of a structure, right? It is the people as a whole, and we actually need to develop processes within our structures to really get the common solidarity, common unity, and common freedom to express our futures, right? So this is not just with respect to external bodies, say the self-determination versus the state, right? That is actually creating the conditions within indigenous societies themselves to really have a strong unity, to be able to express the collective will, right? This is very well addressed by the General Recommendation 39, because that recognizes discrimination both in the internal structures of indigenous peoples as well as the state. If you read carefully General Recommendation 39, and it also involves even access to justice, both within customary systems of law and formal systems of law. So we really need to do our own internal deepening of understanding these principles, right? Because the principles don't say indigenous peoples minus the women have the right to self-determination, right? So what are the procedures and barriers that we need to overcome to really solidify the whole of the collective, right? And this is a battle, struggle that we indigenous women within our societies have to lead, right? And those, for all of those principles, when we say that they apply locally, they also apply to our own institutions. So that is an artificial division to say that self-determination is internal versus external, that this only applies, say, when we are dealing with states, because self-determination is how we exercise our own rights and our own freedom, and to be free also to innovate and change and transform our own structures that do not actually respect human rights, that undermine, say, the rights of women, right? And this is and it would be good if you share your stories with each other, because in those communities where indigenous women have made these advances, it is very clear that the whole is strengthened. That issue of complementarities, even while there are still power dynamics and power deficiencies in indigenous societies. I hope that answers. That's why the need also for women's own organizations, so that you can help each other in addressing our own structures and institutions, as well as playing a full leadership and participatory role in these other venues, policy arenas that we are talking about. Sahim, it's your turn.
Yes. Asiham. Okay, I'm just asking, to what extent do you see that the governments all over the world how to deal with the indigenous people, which is related to their consent, and how this goes with the UN declaration? Is this government like it goes in line with the UN declaration, or what is have been given in declaration or not?
Yes. You see, the UN declaration, it does not create new rights. It just puts together in one declaration all the rights that are already contained in other human rights instruments, right? So this is the issue of whether human rights are given by governments or whether they are there because we exist as people, right? So all of those rights that I read as principles, when it was voted on in the General Assembly, it was passed with only a few objections. There were 4 objections and a few abstentions, right? But it was a General Assembly resolution because this is international law, and if they don't follow them, they're in fact violating rights. Yeah. So we ourselves need to understand these principles to be able to claim and assert our own rights, right? For example, free prior informed consent, it can be exercised in many ways. If governments don't do proper consultations, indigenous peoples have put up barricades, they have showed their own opposition. So this issue of how to express consent or no consent is really a matter of building indigenous strength, because that is what self-determination is all about. Our capacity to assert our rights to our own development and our own futures, right? I know that particularly in very repressive states and where the law in your country does not yet recognize indigenous peoples and our rights, that is the whole purpose of advocacy. And that is the whole purpose why we have gotten this language in international law, because states are bound by international law. If they're not following it, then they're violating rights. Unfortunately, rights really have to be fought for and exercised and used by the people themselves. So yeah, that's the whole dilemma of the need for struggle and understanding the principles that we're promoting.
Pema, you had put your hand up. Did you want to ask a question? Georgie, so Regina said she didn't hear the response to her question. She was the one who was asking about Indonesia. So I don't know if you could quickly highlight some of the responses that you had for her to hear.
Yeah. Yes, because I was talking about access to justice and the right to remedy, and because there are several avenues for advocacy. It can be done at the executive branch, the presidency. Of course, it's very hard if the president himself is the one championing the new capital, right? It can be done through the legislative process when this is becoming a law, how to get your perspectives and your rights included when the law is being passed. And then, of course, the judicial process to actually challenge in national courts the legality of those actions because of the requirements regarding displacement. First of all, to avoid, then the requirement for free prior informed consent, then the requirement for mitigation and minimizing risks. So there are many standards that relate to dislocation, and then when national remedy is not possible, the possibility to go for international courts. Yeah, the two covenants, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, actually have bodies where you can bring cases to when your government is violating your rights, right? In the Americas, there's also the regional court, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. So it is actually the people themselves who understand the whole political context who can best determine what is the form of action that would be most possible and build an advocacy campaign around your understanding of the situation. But most of all, a good understanding of your rights and how this is being respected or abused in national law.
Regina, I hope you were able to get that. So we have time for one more question or comment before our time is up. So is anyone who has a question, another question or a comment before we can hand it back to Georgie for her concluding remarks? We'll check the chat. Fema, please go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to ask one question.
Yes.
Actually, in Nepal, there is an indigenous community called Bankaria, and they are very low in population. I think they are not even more than some hundred something only population currently. And a few decades ago, they were still practicing nomadic life. And only recently that our state has provided them a certain land for a certain time, like certain years of time only. Like a state have provided, like this is the area you can stay here and live your life, but only for certain years. So I think as much as I know, in like in 1 or 2 year, the time that government had provided is going to end. So what is being discussed is that they are going to be shifted into another space. So if this kind of, if this it's a good thing that the state did provided them a certain land because they were like hunter gathering kind of community. But if they are constantly shifted from place to place, that does impact their flow of life, and it's also impacting the way the children's and young children's are accessing information, accessing education and other facilities. And that is also kind of affecting the way they are practicing their culture as well, because a lot of that is connected with their land. So that is one of my concern, like how can we go on about addressing this issue in a whole. And another thing is about the issues of indigenous youth. Currently, a lot of in Nepal, a lot of indigenous communities have actually migrated from their original land to other areas in search of in search of opportunities, in search of better life, in search of education, because of which a lot of knowledge connected to their land and a lot of land history has been actually lost, and those lands are already taken by state. So what my concerns are, for indigenous youth now, for indigenous youth, that's for young children that are coming, the next generation, how do they connect back to their land, and is there any provision, or how do we go on about addressing these issues of forgetting our land history or forgetting our territorial histories and knowledges, for especially for those communities who are already been very much detached from their original spaces. Thank you.
Yes, you have described a situation where land has been lost or they've been moved, or particularly for mobile peoples, right? So what you have described is a situation of trying to recover or trying to revive both knowledge and connections with the land and territory, which is true for many indigenous peoples. Recovery is actually we also have examples of recovery and cultural persistence, but really this requires some connection to your territory or to your land, right? Which is why there is a very strong prohibition on dislocation and resettlement because of the very dire consequences, right? However, for example, in the United States, where people have been completely moved around, denied their territories, and the Native Americans, there are now movements for reparations or even to acquire land. Like, for example, those who have been removed and put in another territory, and that happened to many of them. They have tried to recreate relations with the land where they have been relocated, right? So this issue of people giving land just for a short time, I think the case and the advocacy case for the importance of not moving them anymore, for actually giving them some land or place-based relationship is what has to be fought for, right? Ideally, you see hunters and gatherers and nomadic people, even those who practice shifting cultivation or rotational farming. These are the hardest cases to settle because governments don't recognize mobility as a strategy for land management, when in fact it is the best way to retain management of these lands, like in pastoralism or shifting cultivation or hunter-gatherers. So yeah, being outside your situation, I cannot really say much. It will really have to be those who know the situation well, who will have to study the types of advocacy and proposals that you can put forward. There are others, for example, in Kenya, people have been removed from the forest many times over, and they keep on going back because they know that only by maintaining their relationship with that forest can they continue to live as peoples, right? Yeah, so you've described a very difficult situation.
Thank you, Georgie, and I hope, Emma, you got a response to your answer. Thank you again, Georgie, for coming. And in case anyone else has a question or a comment that you want to share with Georgie, you can always again share it with us, and we will share it with her, and she'll be able to give her response at another time. So, Georgie, I don't know if you have any closing remarks that you want to give before we conclude the session.
Yes, very briefly. I'd like you to revisit the objectives of the session. One, being familiar with key principles and rights that were presented. Second, if you understood some of those examples that were presented on how these principles are being applied in advocacy work. Next is if you're able to analyze text. For example, I presented text from international agreements, but you can also analyze text from your national law to see how these principles are upheld or violated. and to start to apply these principles in your own advocacy strategies or plans, right? Because this is in fact the, what do you call, the purpose of this leadership school. And then, are you able to link your community priorities with these principles that we have brought out, right? So maybe if you can rank your own takeaway from this particular session from 1 to 5, 5 you think you have met the objectives, or 1 we are still far from meeting the objectives of this session. Just for your own assessment of how well you are doing in terms of understanding these principles. And as Winnie said, if you have questions or further points that you want to pursue, for example, you have identified issues that you want to learn more about, you can also bring that to your course facilitators, and this can also be sent to me, and I will be able to respond for them. Well, thanks very much for inviting me, and I hope that you will indeed be very successful in meeting the objectives of this course and leadership school. Thanks to FIMI for doing this.
Thank you, Georgie, and thank you for accepting the invitation and for sharing very critical information. And I'm sure when they read the PowerPoint, they'll be able to reflect, especially on the questions that you've already asked them to. And so we want to present you with a very small token of appreciation from the school in form of a certificate, which we will share with you also via email. So in International Indigenous Women's Forum, the Indigenous Women's Global Leadership School, in recognition to Georgie Carino for the participation and contribution in the capacity building of Indigenous women leaders from Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, and the Pacific during the 10th edition of the Program on Human Rights and International Advocacy Skills, with gratitude on this virtual modality, and it's signed by Teresa Zapeta. So thank you so much. We're very grateful for your time and for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. And we hope that we will see you again in another edition. And we wish you well in your endeavors as well. So thank you so much, Georgie. And I hope that the ladies will also ask many questions that we can forward to you at a later date. So thank you so much.
Okay, and thanks also that I was able to share with you in today's session.
All right, have a good evening, Georgie.
Yeah, thanks, and bye for now.
Bye. All right, sisters. So thank you again for this first session. Please remember to ask all your questions. You can send it to your regional advisors or, to your regional advisors, and we'll be able to share that with Georgie. And I want to now hand over the session to Hortensia because our next guest is here, and all the best with the next session. So Hortensia, welcome. It's nice to see you.
Gracias, Winnie.
Thank you, Winnie. Likewise, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, and welcome to our invited guest today. It's we're very happy to continue this process that we've begun since February. And in every session, as you know, we have various experts on the topics that we are addressing. And our following guest, our next guest, is Mr. Dario Mejia Montalvo. He belongs to the indigenous Senu peoples of San Andres Sotavento. He's a member, or he's a political scientist, of the National University of Colombia with a master's degree in management of development conferred by the University of the Autonomous Regions of the Nicaraguan Caribbean Coast, called Huracan. He's a lecturer and consultant for different organizations and institutions. He's also a member of the National Commission for Labor and Coordination of Education of the Indigenous Peoples of Colombia. Mr. Mejia is the leader of the National Indigenous Organization of Colombia, ONIC. From 2008 to 2012, our brother Mejia served as the ONIC Counselor of Education. He's also the former member of the Board of Directors of the Fund for the Development of Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, better known as FILAC. And he's also the technical secretary of the Permanent Dialogue Mechanisms between national government and the indigenous peoples of Colombia. In 2014, he coordinated the conclusion of the 1953 decree, the indigenous component of the National Development Plan. Additionally, he supported the fast-track procedure within the framework of the final peace accord. Currently, he's a member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for the period from 2023 to 2025. And we want to give a warm welcome and to thank Mr. Mejia for accepting our invitation. And please, sisters, leaders, write down your questions that you would like to ask him. And now that you're in the period of writing your advocacy plan, these experiences will give you some ideas for you to use some of these principles. As Sister Joji mentioned, we can link these principles with our local community and national realities. So welcome, Brother Dario Mejia. We hope that you will have a good dialogue with the participants. You have until 8:30 Guatemala time to share your experiences. But if anyone would like to ask a question, you can just raise your hand and we can try to create a dialogue here. Welcome, Brother Darío. The time is yours. Thank you very much. I want to give a special greeting to all of you. I have 1 hour, is that right? Because I'm already at 8:30 here, so how much time do we have exactly? Yes, starting from now, you have approximately 50 minutes. And then we also have a 25-minute period to dialogue, but you can use your own methodology if you'd like to take questions earlier as you share your experience. All right, thank you very much. I'm trying to get the camera set here. All right. It's a great honor for me to share this space with you today. I would like us to have more of a conversation rather than any kind of a lecture here. I would like to be able to converse with those who are here present today. But I can kick off with some initial comments, and then we can open up for questions and answers. The first that I want to say about the topic that I've been invited to talk about is that the very fact that you are here meeting today on a particular platform is a result of international advocacy that Indigenous peoples have done. You can't understand any of the educational processes or organizational processes without understanding prior struggles that many, many men and women have engaged in the international arena and also at the national level. And it's worth remembering that we, the Indigenous peoples, and the results that we have had as a result of all of the prior organization internationally has led us to where we are now. We are in the year 2023, and we're at the we're many years away from the time where the first indigenous peoples tried to get into the United Nations, which wasn't even called the United Nations at the time, after the First World War. The states who had prevailed in the war tried to establish a political order in the world, and they called it the League of Nations. And it was there that the indigenous peoples, represented by Chief Descaje and the indigenous peoples from Canada and the United States, arrived to say that they were not recognized by the Canadian government or by other governments, that they were not represented by these governments, and that they had to have their own voice. They were not allowed to speak at the League of Nations. And these indigenous peoples had been exiled from their lands and were not able to return. But there was another group of peoples from New Zealand called the Maori people, who also tried to do the same in the United Kingdom a year later, and they ran the same, they had the same result. But all of this is to say that this is not a new topic. And so today, what we call political advocacy is something that has been happening for a long time and has always been part of indigenous demands. And what are the demands of the indigenous peoples? How can we summarize them? Most indigenous peoples of the world have been colonialized, have been the subject of colonialism, where their territories have been encompassed by two results of colonization. One is the establishment of borders on top of the territories of indigenous peoples all over the world. And so these borders were established between nation states, borders that are also political borders within the various nation states. So, political boundaries. And so this is the first big result of colonization. And the second thing that happened all over the world is that they have also developed legal systems that are different from the system of rights the indigenous peoples already had before the colonial processes and before the establishment of these borders of these nation states. So what these two things generated, that is the establishment of borders and the establishment of different legal systems, different than the indigenous systems, what happened was that it undermined the three main aspects of all societies. All societies in the world have the right to live according to their own rules. They have the right to live in their territory, and they have the right to live according to their own cultures. So these are basically the three demands that indigenous peoples have been making throughout history. That they be allowed to live in their territories, that they be allowed to live according to their own cultures and cosmovisions or world visions, system of values, example, and that they be allowed to exercise their own governance systems and their own norms, to have their own governments. So this triumvirate of three rights is something that we can call the essential core, the right to life and survival of indigenous peoples all over the world. And this allowed indigenous peoples to organize these, they organized around these concepts after the establishment of the United Nations. And advocacy processes continued at various levels. Perhaps in this course you have already heard about the emergence of the working group starting in 1982. But before that, in a study by Martinez Cobo, there was a study on indigenous populations because at the beginning of the 1970s in the world, in the international system, they weren't talking about indigenous peoples. They talked about working populations or enslaved populations. Why? Because the norms existing at the time had to do with Convention 157 of the organization, of the International Labor Organization, which then was changed and turned into, I'm forgetting the number now of the convention, but it became a new convention. It's 169, Convention 169 of the ILO, and that's where they start talking about indigenous peoples. But the International Labor Organization, which was established on August 9th of 1982, did consider indigenous peoples. And every year on August 9th, you have the International Day of Indigenous Peoples because that it was that day where there was a formal working group of the United Nations that met to talk about the issues of indigenous peoples at that time. And that first working group that was attended by many, many leaders from all over the world, many of whom are not with us today, some of whom still are and are still involved in political advocacy all over the world. They began their work at that time to try to achieve an international norm and special mechanisms in the UN system. And so the result of all of this work at the international level is the fact that we have the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And it's important that you keep that in mind in its details, because often we say today, okay, the Permanent Forum, but if we think about it, it's actually the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And it's a name that's quite unique in the UN system, because in the UN, at this point, in terms of the current structure of the UN, you had working groups, you had special committees or commissions, then you had the councils, and there's quite a number of categories of names of bodies: the Human Rights Council, the Economic Social Council, the special committees. There's a lot of different names that have to do with the internal regulations of the UN, or the internal structure of the UN. And the fact that the indigenous peoples are not represented by the states, the fact that indigenous peoples do not want to govern themselves always by the state's laws, and they want to have their own structures, led to a discussion about what would be the best name of an organization and how would you best place that organization for Indigenous peoples. And this was the result of a negotiation that was quite intense, one of the greatest and most intense set of discussions had between Indigenous peoples in the UN, because before the year 2000, the member states of the UN were not recognizing Indigenous peoples as a political actor. And previously, there were important debates about what was the best name. Some people wanted to call it, Native peoples. In some regions of the world, they're called First Nations. Others call them ancestral peoples. There's various ways of naming Indigenous peoples according to the region, the political tradition, the whole history of struggle. But there was an agreement reached among Indigenous peoples, first of all, and that's a big lesson for Indigenous advocacy, that first we must be in agreement among ourselves. And one of the things we agreed on was what to call ourselves, because it would have political implications. And we decided on the term Indigenous peoples, which would not exclude in any way the names that each people might give themselves in their own borders. But in terms of international law, the concept that we use is Indigenous peoples. So the first internal agreement of Indigenous diplomacy among internationally was to reach agreement on the rights that these Indigenous peoples have. And the rights can be summarized, although not reduced. You cannot reduce them, but you can summarize them by saying there are political rights, that there are cultural rights, and that there are also territorial rights. So that was the first step, and then there was negotiation with the states for Indigenous peoples to be recognized. And at that time, for the negotiation of the permanent forum, the states were not recognizing Indigenous peoples at that time. And so, Indigenous peoples also didn't want to be incorporated into a committee or a working group that might reduce their status. And so the permanent forum was called a forum because it's a mechanism that doesn't take the other forums that the UN had at that point. And so they were clear that they didn't want to be another working group, another council. And so the agreement between Indigenous peoples was to not use these already existing structures, but to call ourselves something different so that we would avoid being part of the hierarchy and bureaucracy of the UN. On the other hand, the governments were not accepting the idea of Indigenous peoples. And so that's how the Permanent Forum got that name. It's the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So it doesn't have Indigenous peoples, it has Indigenous issues. And being called the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues was a step forward in the huge struggle of Indigenous peoples that continues today. After the establishment of the Permanent Forum, you understand that there are two other important mechanisms inside the UN. One is the Special Rapporteurship on the rights of Indigenous peoples, which informs the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. And the expert mechanisms on Indigenous peoples was also created that meets annually in Geneva. But this is also a result of advocacy and the work of Indigenous peoples. And so these things have been created, as well as other working groups on specific topics. For example, before the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there was already the Convention on Biodiversity. And at first, Indigenous peoples were not being included in that convention. There was some talk of populations, but nothing specific. And in order to not leave out some populations that were located in countries where Indigenous peoples weren't recognized, there was a distinct category of local communities that was created that would include both Indigenous peoples and other actors from rural sectors and unrecognized populations of various kinds. And this has all evolved. And the same thing kind of happened in the Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Desertification. And a lot of organized work has helped these concepts to evolve little by little. So Indigenous peoples do have our own working commissions on different fronts. And it's very important to remember these details because while the framework that regulates these conventions are also norms, but the main norm or set of rules that guides Indigenous peoples is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was established in the General Assembly after the year 2000. It wasn't until 2007 that the declaration was passed, but that was achieved. And in this declaration of the rights of Indigenous peoples, the Permanent Forum was given the mandate of promoting and working for the implementation of the declaration, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we have this whole mandate on one side, the name that is the result of a negotiation of a particular period in history, but also the mandate on Indigenous peoples that came out as a result of a negotiation at another time in history. So I'm trying to give you a sense of the conversation that happened over time so that you can realize that the tendency is always to try to improve on what was able to be negotiated in the past, to have our own voice, to be able to speak for ourselves and to put out our own opinions and challenges in the international sphere. And there's a lot of organization and connection that needs to happen for this to happen. So I wanted to mention this historical aspect to you to show you the central argument, because then when you establish the permanent forum, there's a number of different challenges, right? For example, as part of the recommendations that the Permanent Forum has made, Indigenous women become a central aspect. And recently, Indigenous women have been able to achieve the adoption of Recommendation 93 of CEDAW, which came out of the leadership of women in the Permanent Forum and then led to the establishment of an international commission of Indigenous women that would provide follow-up to these recommendations. But also, there are a number of resolutions that came out of the General Assembly that also have to do with Indigenous women.
So that's the work that Indigenous women have done to have their rights recognized in the framework of Indigenous peoples. And this has been crucial in the entire process, as well as in other processes, such as, for example, at this moment, one of the big discussions in the international arena is the discussion about what's the status that Indigenous peoples should have in the UN discussions. Because although, as I've shown you, Indigenous peoples are not NGOs, they are not civil societies either. And this is very important to keep in mind. Indigenous peoples are not civil societies. Why do we affirm this? We need to go back a little bit. The concept of modern state that we know nowadays was established precisely with this division between government and civil societies. This division between government and civil societies is a division specifically pertinent to the modern state. And Indigenous peoples are not represented by the political structures of the states. They're part of the states, but they have never given up their right to self-government and self-determination. This is very important. So if Indigenous peoples are not civil societies, they cannot be represented at the UN level by sectors of civil society, such as academics or interested parties, businessmen, companies, other members of civil societies, but they're not NGOs either. So if they're not NGOs and they're not local governments or parliamentarians, mayors, governors from different states, different departments, we need a new category to identify Indigenous peoples so that they can participate with equal conditions with these other governments to participate in UN discussions. And Indigenous peoples need to participate in the UN discussions. This is a very important conversation. We're going to have the next permanent forum session from the 17th and the 18th of April, and then on the 20th, there's going to be a hearing, an interactive hearing with the President of the General Assembly. And I'm so sorry that the school on this occasion cannot be present in person in New York, as you've done in the past, but I guess the pandemic is still having an impact, and there are many visa situations, etc. You know exactly what's happening in that respect because you're actually suffering that. But this hearing will take place, and these are the issues through global advocacy that we're seeing. And I also want to mention another important issue in terms of global advocacy has to do with the implementation of some achievements we've had so far. For example, I have celebrated the establishment of the General Recommendation number 39 from CEDAW. I've celebrated that a lot, but this recommendation now needs to become a transversal instrument for the actions, for working plans, for UN agencies, not only from the CEDAW, but to then be also part of instruments that can transform systems. I would say legal, especially at the levels where women have the most disadvantages. but not only key reform for equity, but also in terms of public policies. For example, it is necessary to have a campaign to translate documents to all languages of indigenous peoples. So I think that there's a lot of work that you are doing with your projects in the local level. But I think it's very important that these discussions that are taking place at the global level can be transmitted to the communities so that they can realize that the discussions that take place at other levels to defend the territory, self-government, against discrimination, against exclusion. These are the same struggles that the international mechanisms already established are doing. And these are not satellites working individually. That's not how they work. They are not looking at the realities. They actually feed from these realities and they work in conjunction with one another. Thank you so much for listening to me. With this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you, Brother Dario. I think your experience brings light on so many issues. And now we invite our participants to make comments, questions, for example, in relation to the recent approval of recommendation 39 of the CEDAW. We have seen there are some strategic actions that we can carry out in our communities. So I invite all of you participants to ask questions, to now have a conversation with our brother Dario, taking advantage of his long experience. Elizabeth, you can go ahead, please. Hello, Brother Dario, and hello, sisters all. We have now been here all morning getting ready to work, to get ready for all the work we have to do. But I want above all, thank you for all of this knowledge and experience that you've shared with us. And as our sister Hortensia says, it's so pertinent because we're developing right now our advocacy plans as part of our work with the Global Leadership School. And I am working now on my own plan. So I'm trying to see how to use all of these international frameworks. And although they are won international battles, I like so much that you use that term of indigenous diplomacy and advocacy, because I think that we are, at least in Mexico, this is crucial. Because we as indigenous women have invited our peoples, and we've told them that we need a challenge, we need to come together and have internal dialogue, because we are facing a great challenge in terms of political participation by indigenous women. But even in our own structures, the structures of our own communities, our own peoples, in the inside of our territories. So it's in that arena, but also outside of our communities, outside of those structures that we have. Those have been actually the structures that have included us the least as political subjects. So we have that challenge internally because we are being weakened. I say that because that's what I see in Mexico, what I see in the state of Oaxaca. We are having a series of differences, internal challenges as peoples coming to an agreement in terms of political participation. And the state can use this at any given time to weaken us. So But I wanted to highlight again that this term of Indigenous diplomacy or advocacy is so crucial. So I wanted to thank you for that. I wrote down some terms that you have used to continue reflecting on them. My question would be, what do we do with the challenges that we face at the local level? Imagine if at the local level, we're still facing these challenges, lacking internal dialogue. I can't imagine how we can then move forward in the global arena. So I wanted to make that comment. So more than a question is really a comment, and I thank you in advance for your contribution. Thank you, Elizabeth. I think that we also have two questions in the chat, one from Richa, one from Pema. So we're going to ask our interpreters to please translate these questions so that our brother Dario can understand the question. Yes, this is Carmen. If I can have Winnie or one of the English speakers read the question for the benefit of the English speakers, then I can translate it into Spanish for Dario. If Joy, perhaps you can do that?
Yes. So
Thank you.
I'm translating Richard's question. She says, how can we strategize to best use the general recommendation number 39 in our advocacy at national and regional level? Hortensia, should I go ahead and read the second question also, or do we give space to Brother Dario to answer?
Mejor leámoslo de una vez, por favor.
Okay. The second question is from Pema. She says, I want to know more on how do we exactly do our advocacy when we attend the UN Permanent Forum in person. How do we approach stakeholders like concerned UN representatives, country representatives during the sessions? And how do we prepare at our country at the ground as well before coming to the UN Permanent Forum?
Gracias por la traducción. Entonces, hermano Darío.
Thank you for the translation. So, Brother Dario, I give you now time to answer these questions. Actually, Elizabeth was more like a comment, and then two questions that were translated from the chat. So go ahead, please. Thank you. Thank you so much for the questions. I think that you are building your experience here and your expertise during this course on the rights of Indigenous women. And I think that in itself and everything that FIMI has done and continues to do every day is crucial for the transformation of our realities and the empowerment of Indigenous women in the framework of legal subjects. The first thing I would like to say that I think should be tried is precisely translating into Indigenous languages the information so that people know this information. And I think that it's important for the people to be informed of what this recommendation 39 means. It's not about demonstrating that this is a document and just reading the document or knowing it as a document, but rather to understand in which context this recommendation happens and what are the rights that recommendation talks about, where they come from. Because showing the document or presented as an issue that pertains only to Indigenous women only can take us to a situation of segmentation, separation. And I think that that is not necessary at this time. So it is not a recommendation just for Indigenous women. It is a recommendation for Indigenous peoples, including their authorities and including men, because it is men in many cases who exercise the political power discriminating against women. And they are the ones who are obligated to comply with this document and to change their behavior. So I think there should be a united work to make people understand that this is a powerful document to be coherent with the struggles that men want to carry out as well. That is, men from indigenous peoples cannot say that they fight for the rights of all indigenous peoples if they maintain women in situations of discrimination. So they need to come in as actors. They need to be part of the processes as actors, but they need to facilitate the processes so that women can also be leaders in these processes. That in terms of the form. Now, it's also very important to keep in mind that this form of work is to achieve women's rights in the different structures. It is true that there are structures where men have to change, that women have to change the structures. So we can't forget that the work has to be done in the community structures to allow women to be leaders. But let's not forget that the work has to be done also with the states, because the states are the ones discriminating against indigenous peoples. And this includes discrimination reflected on civil rights, in terms of policies. And these standards are the ones that need to be transformed as well in favor of indigenous peoples. This will include indigenous women as well. When I talk about civil rights law, I am talking about the conditions that the civil situations from governments that allows women to participate in economic situations, from the neighborhood all the way to the state. There are many restrictions in civil law for women. Also, in terms of political participation, in the majority of cases, there are no standards that affect or work towards parity in terms of political participation. So it's very important to make progress and advance in parity, both for men and women. I don't really want to go into the gender discussion because that comes from a different place and a different reality. But it's important that we keep in mind that this is not a gender-based discussion. It's a rights-based discussion. The rights of indigenous women is what we're talking about. So that's one thing. First, we need to get organized and to vindicate, to get our political participation as a right, and to get that back. That's from the recommendation 39. Also, talking about the other question, which is also very important, because for us, the permanent forum members who have been there for a while, it's quite important to provide a formula as to how to organize, to advocate during the session. I think the most important thing is that before arriving at the permanent forum, the delegations from the indigenous peoples, from the different countries, need to organize themselves and have very clear what the program is about, to know the program, to know the documents that are going to be discussed, go to the web page, write properly about the issues, see what issues affect or the most the advocacy plan that you're working on. It's very difficult to tell the whole reality of a country in 3 minutes, but those are the rules that we found when we got there. They're going to be kept that way because a lot of people come from different parts of the world, and as much as possible, we want to allow the majority of them to be able to speak. And the UN rules give us a maximum of 3 hours per segment on a given day. And some of these segments include expert contributions, expert participations. Some will talk 5 minutes, some more. Each minute used is a minute less for the participants to speak and to present their statements. So it's very important to be very well prepared to talk about those structural issues that affect you, that affect those indigenous peoples, but most importantly, to present your recommendations, your proposals for the permanent forum to carry to the UN agencies and to the states. And then we also have side events where people can also talk. But you can find a way to meet with some of the members of the permanent forum. Sometimes may be difficult, but there are opportunities to be in touch with the secretary, with some of the members of the permanent forum. You can see if you can find ways to speak with them. You can ask the secretary, and then go a little deeper on the issues and concerns that you want to present and that you want to talk about. It is also very important to have a dialogue with some of the states, if possible. It's important and it's good to address your to address the meetings or the missions, to ask for a moment to speak with them and other UN agencies. They're all going to be in the room. You can maybe find a way to talk to some of them. It is a complex dynamic for the indigenous women who are here today. I believe that FEMI has a lot of experience. They've been in many sessions of the UN Permanent Forum, and perhaps they also have some general ideas for you as to what's the best way to proceed. Thank you so much. Thank you, Brother Dario. We know that each experience is different, so we invite you to continue asking your questions, making your comments, exchanging ideas, to generate dialogue among ourselves. As our guests have been saying, in order to advocate, it's very important to establish the ability to create strategic alliances and partnerships. We've also been recommended that it's not a good idea to go by ourselves, as individual representatives. There's a lot of information we need to know. So we remind you that our experts, our guests, have a lot of that experience and knowledge because they've already walked that walk. So we want that you, as women leaders, whether you'd like it or not, we are in that situation. We have not, in many cases, not been recognized as peoples just yet. In some cases, we've been recognized as organizations, and we need to keep fighting for that. So let's continue talking about what's the most way to carry out an effective advocacy with the issues that we want to move forward with. Again, I invite you to your questions and comments.
Si no hay más preguntas, si no hay más comentarios, pues
But
también.
if there are no more questions or comments, we'd like to thank our guest again for being here today. We know that he's our ally in the space where he is right now. And later on, perhaps life will allow us to meet him in person. Oh, go ahead, Juliana. I'm sorry. I don't know why I can't raise my hand. I am sorry for interrupting, but I do have a comment that I wanted to make concerning the last few comments from our brother Dario. So first of all, I want to thank him for his experience and all that he has shared with us, because for sure that helps us reflect from different perspectives, different points of view and different areas of our lives. We know that we are in this training process where we're learning. We know that the conditions and the situations of our peoples are difficult. And I know this. I really, it really caught my attention, that part that you mentioned in terms of the difficulties within our own peoples, about discrimination, the discrimination that exists within our own peoples. But I think that it's important to recover our traditional practices, because our peoples have been invaded by different groups. In our case, for example, in Latin America, the Spaniards, of course, brought other practices, other ways of life. And one way or another, they have made us replicate some practices that denigrate women's situations. And this takes us to think about, why don't we claim our values, our principles, the issue of complementarity, of duality, of respect. We have those in our cultures. I am Ayacachiquel, and within our principles and values, we have the respect towards everything that exists, and to value what is feminine, what is masculine. That's also in plants and animals. So why not within human beings as well? So there are many practices that one way or another we have left behind. We've stopped practicing, and we've now taken on other ways of life that somehow makes us today live in this complexity, having women's leadership somehow silenced. So you have shared with us something very important, something that invites us to work within our peoples and to raise our voices in the different spaces. And as you mentioned, often there are spaces that are divided, people going on their own, and it shouldn't be that way. We need to work from our own culture, thinking about collectivity, and that should be the framework for our work, for our struggles. As you have told us, your experience shows that, because of the achievements that have happened throughout the years of fight. Thank you so much. Thank you, Juliana.
So now we'll give the floor over to our brother Dario. Well, I just wanted to conclude, but I want to be respectful and strict with the time. I understand you've had a long session today with other panelists. Perhaps just a few additional minutes to say that during the session of the Permanent Forum this year, we're going to have a conversation on the agenda about Recommendation 39. And FEMI has always, been alert to what's happening with these deliberations. And I'm sure they will propose to the UN agencies and to the governments certain strategies and actions to advance the implementation of this recommendation. I repeat that this should be an integrated and contextual look at things, but it's a place where Indigenous women should have primary leadership. So you are all invited to follow the permanent forum session and to propose some recommendations that could be promoted later with great energy. So once again, I just want to wish you much success in your deliberations and in your work. And I truly hope that I have been able to be useful in some small way with what I've been able to share this morning. As you realize, I didn't have, a prepared written remarks to share with you this morning, but I've been sharing spontaneously. But I'm very grateful to you for your time. You've been very kind. Thank you, Brother Dario. And before you go, we also wanted to give you our deep thanks for sharing your knowledge, experiences, and recommendations so that our advocacy can be more effective as Indigenous women. So very quickly then, we just want to give you this diploma of recognition. It says the International Forum of Indigenous Women, FEMI, and the Global School of Leadership of Indigenous Women recognizes Dario Mejia for his participation and contribution in the formation of Indigenous leaders from Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, and the Pacific during the 10th edition of the International Program of Human Rights and Advocacy Strategies. With gratitude, this is presented to you virtually in March of 2023, and the certificate is signed by our FEMI director, Teresa Zapeta. We will make sure this gets to you electronically in a few minutes. And once again, thank you very much, and we hope to see you again along the way as Indigenous people create new paths for advocacy and for the respect of our rights. Thank you very much, Brother Dario. Thank you. And just one thing, in Colombia, the maternal last name is always included as the second last name, and so I'm just going to include that in my contact information. Thank you very much, brother. Also wanted to thank all of you who are connected here today. We have concluded another virtual session, and we want to continue to invite you to work on your advocacy plans. We are now getting close to the time where we will present our advocacy plans. And so any kind of question or consultation that you have, please make sure you talk with your advisors, and they need to be on top of everything that you're doing. And Joy, if there's no particular information or further questions, we'll go ahead and close the session today.
We can close this, Dorothy.
Gracias. Entonces,
thank you. So we are closing then. Have a good week. Good afternoon, good evening. We wish good rest to those of you who are about to rest. And in Latin America, have a great productive day. And may this be a productive week for you. We'll see you on Wednesday, and we'll be in communication. Thanks.